Hannah Grimmond stood in front of the place where her house had been, holding her youngest child, and argued with her husband about whether 5 of the others should be allowed to go. The house was rubble. Everything in it was gone. The furniture, the dishes, the clothes, the toys, also gone. Buried somewhere under all of it were 5 packed suitcases. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Her children had a place on a government scheme that would take them out of England, and they were due in Liverpool that same day, and everything they had been instructed to bring with them was underneath the house. She did not see how she could send them with nothing. No clothes, no shoes, no towels, no food. She said so. Her husband Edward thought it would be fine. He thought the people running the scheme would sort the children out once they arrived, that it was worth the chance. It is worth stopping on this, because of how the story is usually told. When people talk about the parents who sent their children overseas in 1940, they talk about a decision, a signature, a form. Hannah Grimmond argued against it. She lost the argument, and her children went, and every account of what happened next has her name attached to a choice she did not want to make. The Grimmonds lived in Brixton, in South London, and there were 13 of them. Edward and Hannah, and 11 children. The 5 who would go were Augusta, who everybody called Gussie, and who was 13, Violet, 10, Constance, called Connie, 9, Edward, after his father, called Eddie, 8, and Leonard, called Lenny, who was 5. 5 was the youngest age the scheme would take. Lenny had only just become eligible. You should hold the shape of that household in your head for the rest of this, because it is the thing the numbers later in this story will be sitting on top of. 11 children in a working-class house in South London, 2 parents, 1 income, a war on. And from September 1940, night after night, German bombers over that part of the city. The Grimmonds had been sleeping in a shelter. That is why they were alive to have the argument at all. They came out one morning, after a night of too little sleep, and the house was not there. Everyone in the family survived the bomb. That is the sentence this whole story turns on, and it will not stay true for very long. What was a family in that position actually supposed to do? The bombing of London had begun in earnest at the start of September 1940, and it did not stop. Brixton was hit repeatedly. A house being reduced to rubble was not, in that autumn, an unusual event on those streets. It was a nightly one, somewhere. And a family that has just lost everything is in a specific and unglamorous kind of trouble. The Grimmonds had 11 children, and no house, no furniture, no clothes beyond what they were standing in, and nowhere obvious to go. So the offer on the table was not abstract. There was a government scheme that would take 5 of their children out of the country entirely, to Canada, where nobody was dropping anything on anybody, and where they would be housed and fed and schooled at somebody else's expense until it was over. Over 210,000 British children had been registered for it. Hannah's objection was not to the idea, it was to the suitcases. And to understand why that was not a small objection, you have to know what the scheme actually was. Edward Grimmond had put his children's names down for that scheme. It is why 5 suitcases had been packed in the first place, and why they were now underneath his house. The scheme was called the Children's Overseas Reception Board, and it had been set up in June 1940 because of a class problem. Wealthy British families were already sending their children abroad privately, at their own expense, to relatives in Canada and the United States. This was noticed, particularly by people who could not afford to do it, and it was becoming politically awkward that safety overseas was something you could buy. So the government built a scheme to do the same thing for everyone else, free, by application. Volunteer escorts, including doctors and nurses, would travel with the children. Thousands had already gone and arrived and were safe. That last part matters more than anything else in this story. Corb was not a reckless scheme that got children killed. It was a working scheme that had already carried several thousand children across the Atlantic without a single incident. Which is exactly why Edward Grimmond thought his wife was worrying about nothing. He was not being careless. He was reading the evidence. But Gussie, Violet, Connie, Eddie and Lenny were not on the confirmed list. They were on the reserve. Every so often on this channel, we get to a moment where the documents stop being administrative and start being about a specific woman on a specific morning. That is what the next part is. If you want more of that, subscribe. Now, the list. Being on the reserve list meant the Grimmond children were not going anywhere. They were the ones who would sail only if somebody else dropped out. Their 5 suitcases had been packed against a possibility, not a booking, and those suitcases were now under a collapsed house in Brixton. The family travelled to Liverpool anyway, to Sherwood Lane School, where the Corb children were being held before boarding. And there, the thing happened that nobody in this story chose. The escorts, the volunteers who would be travelling with these children and looking after them at sea, learned what the Grimmond family had just been through. They saw 5 children who had come out of a shelter to find their home gone. So they took them off the reserve list and put them on the sailing list. Read that again from Hannah Grimmond's position. She had argued that her children should not go because they had nothing. The people running the scheme looked at the same fact, that these children had nothing, and concluded the opposite. The very thing she had used as her reason against it became the reason they were moved up. Nobody in that room did anything wrong. On Friday the 13th of September 1940, the ship left Liverpool with the Grimmond children on board. She was called the City of Benares, and she was 4 years old, a passenger liner built in Glasgow that had run the route to India. Ellerman Lines had offered her to the government for Corb. She had been repainted grey. Defensive guns had been fitted. There was a discussion, at some point in the planning, about whether to mark her in some way as a ship carrying children. Corb decided against it. On board were 90 Corb children between 5 and 15, 10 escorts, 91 fare-paying passengers, including 10 more children, 6 convoy representatives, and a crew of over 200, most of them Indian seamen from the Lascar service and Portuguese Goans in the catering department. She sailed as the lead ship of her convoy, in the center column, with a Royal Navy escort. To the children, she was a luxury liner, because that is what she looked like. Several of the survivors later described the food and the cabins with something close to disbelief. Gussie Grimmond, 13 years old, was travelling with her 4 younger brothers and sisters and was responsible for them. For 4 days nothing happened, and Hannah Grimmond in London knew nothing at all. This is the part of the story that has no documents in it, and we are not going to fabricate any. There was no way for a parent to be told where the ship was. There was no radio bulletin about it. The convoy's position was a military secret, for the obvious reason. What she had was a date of departure and an expected arrival in Canada, and a gap of roughly 2 weeks in between, in which she was simply required to get on with it. She had 6 other children and no house. That is the condition Corb parents were living in as standard. Not grief. Grief comes later, and only for some of them. Just an absence, with a slow clock attached to it, and no information. Several thousand families across Britain were doing exactly this in September 1940, and for almost all of them it ended with a letter from Canada. On the evening of the 17th of September, in the North Atlantic, the Royal Navy escort was detached and sent elsewhere. The convoy went on alone. The city of Benares was sighted late that evening by a German submarine, U-48, under the command of Heinrich Bleichrodt. 2 torpedoes were fired at midnight, and both missed. A third was fired at 1 minute past midnight on the 18th of September and struck the ship in the stern. She sank in about half an hour, roughly 600 miles out into the Atlantic, in a gale. 258 of the 406 people on board died. 77 of them were Corps children. Of the 90 Corps children who had boarded at Liverpool, 13 survived. The 5 Grimmond children all died. That is the whole of what we are going to say about the sinking itself, and it is deliberate. There are survivor accounts of that night. They are in the public record, and they are unbearable. This channel is not going to use them as material. What was done to those children is not a scene for us to stage. The Admiralty was criticized afterwards for allowing a ship with children aboard to lead the convoy, and for detaching the escort. The German government's position was that the ship was a legitimate military target. None of that was known in Brixton for some days. The rescue took a very long time, which is why the news did too. HMS Hurricane reached the position 24 hours after the sinking, in a force 8 gale, and picked up 105 people. 1 lifeboat was missed entirely. It was not found for 8 days. When HMS Anthony finally reached it, there were 46 people in it who were still alive, 6 of them boys. So for more than a week after the ship went down, there was no final list. Names were still moving between one column and the other. A parent in London could be told that their child was missing, and then, a week later, that their child was alive. For the Grimmonds, there was no second list. The letters that Corb sent to the families of the children who did not survive were signed by Geoffrey Shakespeare, who chaired the board. One of them, sent to a man named Tom Myatt about his 9-year-old daughter Beryl, is held today by the Imperial War Museums. It tells him that his daughter was not among the rescued, and that there is no prospect of further survivors being found. Somewhere in that same postbag were the letters about Gussie, Violet, Connie, Eddie and Lenny. In a few minutes, we are going to arrive at the thing this entire episode exists to say. And it is not about a ship. It is about what a country did to a particular kind of woman in the space of about a week. What happened next in Britain is the part that gets left out, and it is the reason we are telling this from Hannah Grimmond's side rather than from the ship's. The country was appalled, and it was appalled loudly. Churchill cancelled the Corb scheme. Children who were already packed and waiting to sail were ordered to go home. Overseas evacuation as a government policy ended in a matter of days, and the board that had registered 250,000 children was wound up. That was the correct decision, and almost nobody argued with it. But look at what it did to the position of the parents who had already sent theirs. Before the 18th of September, sending your child overseas was a responsible act. The thing a careful parent did, endorsed by the government, envied by families who could not get a place. After the 18th of September, it was the thing that had killed 77 children. The policy reversed overnight. The parents could not. Hannah Grimmond had argued against sending them. She had been overruled by her husband and then overtaken by the scheme's own escorts. And she spent the rest of her life as a woman who had sent 5 children to sea in wartime. This is the observation this whole story exists to make, so I want to state it plainly. The women in this war were asked to do something that has no good version. They were told, by their government and by every poster on every wall, that a responsible mother sends her children away from danger. Then they sent them away and were expected to function, to keep working, keep queuing, keep the other children fed, inside a silence they had no way to end. And when a scheme failed, the reversal did not land on the officials who designed it. It landed on the household. There is no record of anyone in authority apologizing to Hannah Grimmond. The board wrote to her. The board was then dissolved. The war carried on, and her surviving children needed feeding. What we are looking at is not a mother who made a bad decision. It is a woman who made the argument against the decision, lost it to a system that was operating exactly as designed, and then absorbed the entire cost of that system's one catastrophic failure inside her own house. The suitcases she was worried about were, in the end, the least of it. The Grimmonds had 11 children. After the 18th of September 1940, they had 6. We cannot trace Hannah Grimmond much further in the public record, and we are not going to invent an ending for her. She is not a person history followed. She appears in this story because of what happened to her children, which is the same reason almost every woman in this series appears at all. What is documented is the shape of the thing. A house in Brixton was destroyed, and everyone in it lived. 5 of the children were moved off a waiting list precisely because their family had lost everything. 5 days later, they were at sea, and 4 days after that they were not. And a government scheme that had already carried several thousand children safely to Canada and Australia and New Zealand was ended because of one night. Every one of those several thousand children came home eventually. Their parents had made the same decision the Grimmonds made, for the same reasons, on the same advice. The difference between those families and this one is not judgment. It is not care. It is not love. It is which ship. If you are watching this on a television, pick up your phone and leave a comment. Was there a Corb child in your family, or a family that applied and did not get a place? These children were not asked. Most of them never told anyone what happened next. We write it down. Tell us the name and the year, because the 77 have names, and most people could not tell you one of them. There is one more story we have already started, and it begins with a woman who volunteered to escort other people's children and spent 8 days in an open boat. One of the lifeboats from the city of Benares was overlooked for 8 days. There were 6 boys in it, and a music teacher from London who had volunteered as an escort and had no children of her own. Next time, what Mary Cornish did in that boat.